This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.
Fantastic. Welcome, everyone. My name is Liz Carolyn. I'm a consultant and writer, but I'm also kind of affiliated with the IIEA through one of their groups, one of their working groups. And I'm absolutely delighted to be chairing and carrying us through the next hour or so for the Authoritarian Resurgence in World Politics. And so, excuse me, we're delighted to be joined here today by Alexander Cooley. At the end, he's the Claire Tao Professor of Political Science and the Vice Provost of Research and Academic Centers at Columbia, and Alexander Dukalskis, Associate Professor in the School of Politics and International Relations at our own University College Dublin here in UCD. So our speakers are going to talk for about 20 minutes about their fantastic new book and take us through some of the ideas that are contained within that. We're then going to be opening up to Q&A. And so for those of you here in the room, when we get to the Q&A, I'm just going to ask you to put up your hand and wait for a microphone, because we have quite a lot of people who have dialed in online to watch this. And so we want to make sure that they can hear your questions and interventions as well. And for those of you who are online, hello. Thank you for joining us. And you should be able to use there should be a box there for you to be getting some questions to us. Just to flag that today's discussion, both the presentation by the two Alexanders and the Q&A will both be on the record. So just bear that in mind if that's something that you are thinking about. Yes, so I want to hand over to both of you. You have your fantastic new book out. Tell us about it.
That's great. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having us, and to everyone who organized. So our book is Dictating the Agenda, the Authoritarian Resurgence in World Politics. Our main argument is that authoritarian states over the last few decades have developed the capabilities and the confidence to be able to promote their own ideas, norms, values into the international system, and to be able to subvert existing international institutions and networks to promote illiberal aims. Of course, this is the case with regard to international organizations like the United Nations, Human Rights Council, or pro-democracy, democracy promotion networks. But what we argue in the book is that you're also seeing this in areas that are not explicitly kind of high politics in international relations. So areas like media, universities, sports, consumer behavior and consumer boycotts. So we're starting to see authoritarian resurgence influence these issue areas as well. The authoritarian resurgence, we argue, it's multifaceted. It's touches a lot of different issue areas, and it's increasingly aided and abetted by illiberal actors within liberal democracies. Just to be clear, we don't argue that authoritarian efforts to promote illiberal aims are successful all the time, just like kind of liberal human rights efforts are not successful all the time, but they're increasingly successful and they're learning fast, basically, we argue. So that's kind of the central argument. To make this argument, we rewind and take a critical look at the 1990s as a time when, of course, the Soviet Union had collapsed, which delegitimized single-party communist rule and central planning. China was coming out of the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre, and it kind of looked to many observers like it was holding on to power just by force and not by having consent of the governed. And so in this atmosphere, the United States, as a liberal democratic global superpower, was able to exert enormous influence globally, along with its mostly liberal democratic allies. And it did this, we argue, in two ways. One is basically soft power, so the kind of power of emulation and attraction. Other states wanted to organize their systems according to these standards of liberal democracy. The other way this model was advanced, or these ideas were advanced, is advocacy. And human rights organizations and activism could basically go around the world and promote ideas of democracy and human rights, and had a lot of latitude to be able to do so. Okay? And this was a powerful model, actually. Authoritarian states were on the defensive. They were under a lot of international pressure at this time. We know this because some of them actually democratized. And we also know this because the ones that didn't democratize pretended to be democracies, right? So they held elections and kind of simulated democracy because those norms were so valued. They felt pressure compelled to pretend. So this model was powerful, but it was based on some assumptions. And we articulate 3 assumptions that it was based on. One is that the United States and the West had efficacious authority. Basically, that they were seen as effective and competent and as having authority because of their competence. So you can think about, I mean, if you're a sports fan, you can think of the 1992 USA Dream Team in basketball. Not a lot of basketball fans in the room, I guess, but dominated the Olympics. You can think about the CNN effect in the media sphere. You can think about American universities at the time being like dominating the league tables of top universities in the world. So there was this assumption of US and Western efficacious authority. The second assumption, and an assumption that would continue. The second assumption was that the US and the West would have disproportionate market power going forward, that Western consumers and institutions would be able to invest in sustaining global liberal democratic networks and values, okay? And that would continue. The third assumption was that these advocacy organizations I mentioned earlier would continue to be able to do their work in a politically autonomous way, that they would be able to go around the world and promote democracy and human rights and liberalism. When we look back to the 1990s and scholarship in the 1990s, we were struck by, a lot of people were criticizing globalization, of course, but the threats they identified were things like religious extremism, globalization that would wipe out kind of cultural difference. Very few, if any, observers at the time foresaw the resurgence of hardcore, unapologetic authoritarian states that would exert influence in global politics. Okay, so that's kind of striking from our point of view because it shows that these assumptions were pretty deeply rooted, right? That they would socialize authoritarian states into being more liberal actors. So what happened, basically? Why are we here today, looking at the situation we have today? Those assumptions got undermined over time. Okay? In terms of the US and Western efficacious authority, it got undermined both because of challengers, because of the rise of China and other challengers, but also because of missteps by the West itself. The invasion of Iraq on grounds of democracy promotion was catastrophic error. The financial crisis, 2008 to 2010, undermined faith in the economic system. So that assumption began to be eroded. Market power shifted eastward. So the Western consumer is still very important, still has a lot of global power, but the economic center of gravity moves more towards China and Asia, basically. And finally, political autonomy. So civil society groups and NGOs started to be framed as a security threat, particularly after the color revolutions of in the post-Soviet space in the mid-2000s. No longer were they seen as just kind of autonomous civil society actors promoting their beliefs. They were seen as political tools of the West, basically. Right? On top of all of that, authoritarian states learned from one another, sometimes explicitly by swapping lessons and legislation between one another, sometimes implicitly by just kind of watching what worked to parry liberal democratic pressures. So they were learning, and they learned not only to survive in a globalized era, but to thrive, basically, to use global interconnectedness to their advantage. The last point I'll make, and then I'll hand over to Alex, is that this is all undergirded or supported by a massive economic shift away from liberal democratic powers towards illiberal powers. So a very simple way to think about this, we took rankings from the Varieties of Democracy project, which is a Sweden-based research institute, basically, that measures all kinds of different types of democracy, and it measures liberal democracy in every country, in every year, all over the world. Okay? So liberal democracy, protections for individual political rights, ability to vote, political parties that can contest. Okay, And every year it ranks every country from number 1 to number 185 or whatever. Okay? Ireland performs very well, by the way. We were number 6 last year. So in 1991, the top 25% most liberal democratic states in the world had 84% of global GDP. So an absolutely dominant economic position in 1991. The 25% least liberal democratic states, in other words, like the hardcore dictatorships of the world, had only 4% of global GDP. So economic minnows, I mean, really marginal to the economic system of the world. Fast forward 30 years to 2021, top 25% most liberal democratic states have 59% of global GDP. Still a majority, but clearly their relative economic power has eroded. Meanwhile, the bottom 25% most authoritarian states in the world have 26% of global GDP. And indeed, there are 9 countries that are in the bottom of the dictatorship ranking and the top of the economic ranking. And so you have these hardcore, unapologetic dictatorships that have economic power in ways today that they didn't several decades ago. And all of this transpired in an interconnected, globalized era where the assumption was liberal democracies in the West was going to socialize authoritarian states into kind of our way of doing things. And what we didn't appreciate at the time, or what observers didn't appreciate at the time, is that with all those interconnectedness, all those interconnections, came leverage that authoritarian states could use to advance their own aims and viewpoints and practices once they became able to do so. So that's kind of the big picture of the book. I'll hand over to Alex to pick up from there.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks for having us. Thank you, Liz. This is a real pleasure. I'll just give some examples from the case chapters that we have and some of the illustrations and data that we collected. So, for instance, in the realm of global media, it used to be the case that the West and liberal democracies were dominant in terms of both the media outlets that we had globally, right? Alex mentioned Alex D and Alex C. That's our traveling roadshow set of names. The CNN effect, that also referred to the fact that liberal democratic outlets were the global media outlets, right? In the 90s and 2000s. That starts to change. And the inflection point is really 2008, year of the Beijing Olympics. And one of the lessons that the Chinese government takes out of the Beijing Olympics is that Western media coverage, right, set the agenda and the terms in the run-up to the 2008 games, right? Concerns about human rights, about entire areas of the city being sort of flattened to make way for sort of installations in the games, that they got a lot of unwanted press coverage and spotlight effects exactly because they did not have a global media outlet. And just weeks after the games, they implement a plan where back then it was CCTV, now CGN, they create this sort of global media outlet. At the same time, roughly the same time, Russia too, with its global Sputnik network. Now, why is this important? On a couple of different levels, right? One is we see the shrinking of legacy media outlets like the CNN, like CNN or BBC, right? Foreign bureaus are being shut down. China and Russia are increasing their regional foreign bureaus. And we actually put pins in them in the book. And that's one, right? This sort of geography of regional bureaus, Latin America, the Middle East, Africa. But a second area that doesn't get enough press coverage, we would argue, is in the area of content sharing agreements. So international news feeds, traditionally in the 90s, relied on wires like Reuters, the AP, AFP. And if you were a regional or a national newspaper, you would pay a subscription and you would grab the news feed, and that would be your coverage of world news. Increasingly, Xinhua, the Chinese state outlet, and ITAR-TASS are providing the news feeds overseas. And one of the ways that they do it is through content sharing agreements with national and regional newspapers. And so we counted as many of these as we could. We found roughly about 100 content sharing agreements with the Russian information system, about 300 with the Chinese information system. And this is important exactly because taking these news feeds, right, puts on the agenda certain perspectives, certain ways of framing international politics, and decreases the coverage of other things, right? Democratic protests, perhaps corruption scandals or investigations. So that's one aspect. We see that the global media is no longer not only dominated by Western liberal democracies, that the trend is in the other realm. We also collected data on how authoritarian states go after foreign journalists. It used to be the case that international journalists, there was this liberal democratic norm that foreign journalists had access, right, to all sorts of international spaces. Of course, there was always, some restrictions, some sort of pretenses given. But what we show is over 1,000 instances of administrative actions taken against foreign journalists by authoritarian countries. China, Azerbaijan, Turkey are the big offenders here, Russia as well. And these include not assaults, right? There are other NGOs that count physical threats and intimidation against journalism, but things like visa denials, the revocation of accreditation, expulsion on administrative grounds, that all these practices are also growing as a way of controlling the information space. So we're in this interesting position where authoritarians have, in some cases, more access, right, to sort of liberal democracies in their coverage, right, than we do authoritarian states. The other realm I'll talk about very briefly, international sport. Here, part of the chapter is looking at the rise of mega events in authoritarian states, right, being used for regime kind of propagandizing purposes. Up until 2008, the Olympics or the World Cup, FIFA Men's World Cup, have been held in democracies for a string of decades. That broke, and so we have Beijing, the Sochi Olympics, Beijing 2022, and which is also an interesting contrast with 2008. China's much more assertive in covering its own mission, and then the Qatar Games of 2022, where there was a lot of interesting sort of pushback and criticism of the host. But we also look at club sport and the inflow of authoritarian money in here. We can talk about the English Premier League if you like, the City Football Group, Roman Abramovich, or a Saudi investment fund, right, and the changes that they're making into these summer games. But the one example I'll leave you with here is the fate of the National Basketball Association in the U.S. So in 2019, a general manager of the Houston Rockets on social media made a political post in solidarity with the Hong Kong demonstrators, sort of a pro-democracy kind of statement. This really angered Chinese authorities. The Houston Rockets have a special place in the Chinese market because they had drafted the most legendary Chinese player around 2008, Yao Ming. And the reaction of the Chinese government was telling and swift. This is just a tweet, right? Back then they were tweets of the general manager. They shut down coverage of the league. They cost the NBA hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. They demand apologies. They go through this back and forth with the NBA. And a couple of sort of, really striking dimensions of this. One is most players in the NBA are completely silent about this, right? And why? Well, one reason is, and we did not know this until we did the research, massive amounts of lucrative sneaker and apparel deals that they now have in the Chinese market as separate deals, right? And so a lot of players were saying, it's not our business to get into this. Obviously this is an issue that's important to China, right? You saw a really different political reaction than you would have perhaps expected. And then I think the other part of this that's really fascinating is the increasing media coverage, right, and the lucrative contracts, right? More people in China watch NBA games than they do in North America, right? And so sort of the TV rights and revenues associated have also changed. So this is an illustration of what Alex was saying about market shifts and consumer shifts. I'll leave you with one idea here. When Yao Ming was drafted by the Rockets in 2008, we noticed a string of newspaper commentaries speculating, oh my gosh, is this going to be the Disneyfication of China? Is the NBA just going to take over China and turn them into a bunch of sort of sports-obsessed American fans? And really the question now is, who is changing who? And on what grounds, right? And what are the new rules that are being sort of reinscribed here? Very final point. We wrote this, we were reviewing proofs in November 2024. As Donald Trump was elected, we made some adjustments in our proofs and some insertions and updates. And I think it's fair to say that the election of Donald Trump has actually turbocharged authoritarian dynamics across all four of these issue areas, right? Whether it's an attack on the independence of universities, whether Trump himself looking at hosting the World Cup next year and the Olympic Games as a chance for him to bolster his own personal kinds of regime credentials, or whether it is interventions in American and international media, cutting funding for American and international media, and of course targeting media that he regards as sort of critical or slandering of him. And so I think where we end this is, we can perhaps debate whether the American president is illiberal or not, but certainly his actions and policies seem to be turbocharging all of these areas and dynamics that we talked about.
This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.